August 21, 1942, Guadalcanal. A gray Pacific dawn pushes through the mist hanging over Henderson Field. The jungle is still wet from the night storms, and the airstrip, just the strip of dirt carved out by desperate hands, vibrates under the rumble of distant Japanese artillery. Empty crates sit stacked beside the runway, their labels washed away by rain. Marines move among them with quiet urgency, counting what little they have left. Ammunition is rationed. Medical supplies are running out. Breakfast is a thin scoop of canned rations meant for men already losing weight by the day. Out at sea, the horizon is empty. No transports, no reinforcements. No guarantee that anyone beyond this island even knows the full situation on the ground. And in Rabaul, hundreds of miles to the northwest, Japanese commanders are confident. They believe the Americans cannot possibly sustain troops here. They believe hunger will do their work for them. But on Guadalcanal, survival now depends on something far larger than courage. It depends on whether the United States can turn a distant, unfinished airstrip into the center of a logistical miracle.
The struggle for Guadalcanal did not begin with a clash of armies. It began with calculations, strategic, geographic, and deeply flawed on one side. For 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan advanced across the Pacific with a speed no Allied planner had anticipated. Their fleet moved with discipline. Their pilots were experienced. Their supply lines, though stretched, matched the rhythm of offensive momentum. Every gain seemed to reinforce a belief within the Imperial General Staff that the United States lacked the capacity to fight a sustained war thousands of miles from its shores. This confidence took root long before the 1st Marines stepped onto Guadalcanal. Japanese military doctrine had been shaped by decades of regional operations in China and Southeast Asia, campaigns where local resources could be seized and supply chains remained relatively short. In the vast Pacific, Japan still relied on fragile transports and narrow windows of nighttime movement, but planners assumed opponents would struggle even more. To them, American logistics were a lumbering machine, slow to mobilize, slow to deploy, and unlikely to survive under pressure. The months preceding Guadalcanal appeared to support that assumption. The United States, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, scrambled to organize convoys. Transports were scarce. Escort ships were spread thin across multiple fronts. Every movement carried risk. In the early Pacific battles, Wake Island, the Philippines, Java, the Americans had often been forced to abandon outposts not because of battlefield defeat, but because sustaining them had become impossible. Japanese commanders studied these retreats and concluded that U.S. resolve collapsed when its fragile supply networks were threatened. Yet by mid-1942, the strategic map had begun to shift. The Battle of the Coral Sea halted Japan's southern expansion. A month later, at Midway, the Japanese Navy lost 4 frontline carriers, an operational blow that forced Tokyo to reconsider its timelines. Control of the Central Pacific hung in the balance, and both sides understood that the next major move could determine momentum for the rest of the war. That move came not from deliberate planning, but from urgent necessity. Reconnaissance flights revealed that Japan was constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal, one that could threaten Allied shipping routes between the United States and Australia. If completed, it would split the Allied position in half. Commanders in Washington and Melbourne knew they had no time left for preparation. They committed to the first major American ground offensive of the war. On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal with a mixture of determination and uncertainty. They seized the airfield quickly, renaming it Henderson Field, but from the moment the first Japanese counterattacks began, the flaw in American planning became clear. The fleet that had delivered the Marines withdrew early, forced away by Japanese naval threats. Equipment lay scattered on the beaches. Pallets of ammunition were abandoned mid-unloading. Crucial construction materials, specialized tools, aviation fuel, and medical supplies were left on transport decks as the Navy pulled back into open water. In Washington, logistics officers estimated that the Marines had enough supplies for just a few weeks of sustained resistance. Japanese planners estimated even less. To Tokyo staff officers, this was proof. America could seize territory, but it could not hold it. Every intercepted report reinforced their confidence. They believed the Marines at Henderson Field would be isolated, hungry, and exhausted long before reinforcements arrived. And for the Marines, those predictions felt dangerously accurate. Within days, food rations were cut. The humid jungle consumed clothing and equipment. Malaria spread. Japanese artillery harassed the airfield constantly, and every cargo crate became a lifeline. Early cargo deliveries were small, inconsistent, and costly. Ships unloading offshore risked attack at any moment. There were nights when Marines counted bullets as carefully as they counted their remaining meals. But even in those early, desperate weeks, a realization was forming among Allied commanders. Guadalcanal would not be won by firepower alone. It would be won or lost through the steady, relentless movement of ships, fuel, ammunition, aircraft parts, and food across thousands of miles of contested ocean. And that realization marked the beginning of a shift that neither side fully understood yet.
The first weeks on Guadalcanal revealed a truth that shaped the rest of the campaign. The island itself was an enemy. Jungle humidity rotted equipment. Sudden storms flooded foxholes. Mosquitoes carried malaria through camps at a pace no medic could contain. Even in the absence of Japanese attacks, the environment punished every mistake. And with each day that passed, the gap between what the Marines needed and what they received grew wider. The Japanese believed this was an advantage. Their supply strategy for the island relied on short, fast destroyer runs known as the Tokyo Express, nighttime missions that delivered soldiers but almost no heavy equipment or bulk cargo. To Tokyo's planners, this was sufficient because they assumed the Americans would receive even less. If both sides struggled to send men and material across the vast Pacific, then the Marines, far from their bases and lacking experience, would collapse first. In those opening months, the situation seemed to validate their confidence. Early American resupply attempts were chaotic and often disastrous. Transports anchored offshore became instant targets for Japanese bombers. Cargo was pushed overboard to speed unloading, leaving Marines diving into the surf to salvage crates before they sank or drifted away. Bulldozers, radios, and engineering tools, vital for expanding Henderson Field, were lost to the sea. Food shortages grew severe. Marines boiled rice seized from abandoned Japanese camps, sometimes sharing it among entire squads. Aviation fuel was stored in shallow pits covered by camouflage netting, vulnerable to a single lucky shell. There were days when aircraft took off with only enough fuel for a single sortie. Each evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, American ships withdrew to avoid nighttime attacks, leaving the Marines alone with whatever supplies had been unloaded before dusk. It was during these precarious weeks that two contrasting logistical philosophies became apparent. Japan's focus centered on speed and mobility. Their destroyers could deliver troops rapidly, but were incapable of transporting the tons of ammunition, fuel, and construction equipment required for a prolonged campaign. Japanese doctrine assumed battles would be decided quickly, before heavy logistics became decisive. The United States, by contrast, was learning under fire that modern warfare demanded something different. The seizure of Henderson Field made Guadalcanal a strategic anchor. It could no longer be treated as a temporary holding point. It needed to become a fortress, an air hub, and eventually a springboard for further operations. That transformation required more than courage. It required engineering, manpower, and above all, volume. In late August, the first major construction units began arriving. Navy engineers and Seabees assessed the battered airstrip, repairing craters under artillery fire. They installed makeshift fuel drums, improved drainage, and began carving supply roads through the dense jungle. Each completed task highlighted the same truth. The island could only survive if a reliable supply chain was built.
By September, the U.S. command recognized the stakes. Guadalcanal could either become the turning point of the Pacific War or a costly disaster. And so a decision was made, a decision that would reshape the entire campaign. The United States began reorganizing its Pacific logistics system from the ground up. Convoys were restructured. Escort groups were increased. Cargo ships were rerouted from other theaters. Entire task forces were assigned solely to ensure that crates, fuel tanks, and ammunition reached the island intact. The Japanese, meanwhile, intensified their night attacks and considered the growing American presence a temporary problem. Their assumption remained unchanged. The Marines would break before American logistics could adapt. They believed starvation and exhaustion would do what artillery failed to accomplish. But as weeks passed, the rhythm of supply began to shift. More transports were attempting landings. More crates were stacked near the airfield. More fuel drums collected around new revetments. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance began to change. Guadalcanal was no longer a desperate foothold. It was becoming a logistical test, one that would reveal which nation truly understood the demands of industrial war. And that test would unfold across multiple dimensions, each shaping the outcome in ways neither side fully anticipated.
War on Guadalcanal unfolded across layers of human endurance, tactical necessity, and strategic miscalculation. Each dimension revealed a different truth about why the struggle for the island became a turning point, not simply because of who fought there, but because of what each side believed about its own ability to sustain the fight. The Marines experienced this reality first. Daily life blurred into a cycle of exhaustion and calculation, measured not only by incoming shells or Japanese assaults, but by the dwindling weight of supply crates. The jungle punished every movement. Heat drained strength long before combat began. Rainstorms drowned equipment and turned trenches into swamps. Malaria swept through the ranks so aggressively that even those still able to stand moved with the stiffness of men twice their age. Rations told the story most clearly. Early supply failures meant that food arrived sporadically and in amounts far below what combat units required. Marines shared whatever they could salvage: scraps of canned meat, dry biscuits softened by humidity, rice taken from abandoned Japanese camps. Weight loss became universal. Belts hung loose. Faces grew thin. These shortages affected far more than comfort. They influenced every decision made on the battlefield. Ammunition had to be conserved, sometimes to a degree that felt dangerous. Marines counted their bursts carefully, knowing that an unnecessary shot today could cost them a critical round tomorrow. Even grenades were rationed, reserved only for moments of absolute necessity. Every firefight required judgment, discipline, and the constant awareness of scarcity. And yet, despite the hardship, moments of relief revealed the island's deeper truth. When supply crates finally reached Henderson Field, sometimes just a few dozen at a time, the effect was immediate and emotional. A stack of rifle magazines, a handful of new boots, or a pallet of rations could lift morale across entire companies. The Marines understood something that would become central to the campaign. Courage kept them fighting, but supplies kept them alive. Henderson Field itself embodied this reality. More than a piece of ground, it was the core of the entire struggle. Whoever controlled that airstrip controlled the sky, and whoever controlled the sky controlled the island's supply routes. Even a small number of American fighters and dive bombers could challenge Japanese convoys, protect inbound transport ships, and disrupt enemy movements. But every sortie required resources the Marines barely had. Aviation fuel stored in buried drums, spare parts cannibalized from damaged aircraft, and ammunition that arrived slower than Japanese attacks destroyed it. The Japanese understood Henderson Field's importance from the beginning. Nearly every major attack, whether by infantry, naval bombardment, or airstrike, was designed to knock the airfield out of operation. Their strategy relied on timing, delivering troops at night by destroyer, assaulting the perimeter, and bombarding the runway until it became unusable. If they could silence Henderson Field, the Marines would become isolated, unable to protect their convoys or support reinforcements. Japanese planners envisioned a rapid collapse once the airfield went dark. Their confidence rested on years of observed American logistical difficulties. From the Philippines to Java, U.S. forces had abandoned positions not because of defeat in battle, but because supply lines collapsed under pressure. Japanese commanders believed the same pattern would repeat here. They viewed Guadalcanal as a temporary problem, when easily corrected once hunger and exhaustion forced the Marines to withdraw. With this assumption, Japan committed to a limited supply effort of its own. Destroyers of the Tokyo Express could move quickly and deliver troops efficiently, but they had almost no capacity for bulk cargo. Heavy artillery, construction equipment, food, and fuel rarely reached the island. It was a strategy built on speed and confidence, not sustainment. But while the Japanese relied on speed, the Americans began relying on change. From late August onward, U.S. command recognized that Guadalcanal required more than sporadic deliveries. It demanded a system capable of feeding an expanding garrison, sustaining an air force, and supporting continuous operations. What began as improvised solutions rapidly evolved into logistical innovation. Convoys were reorganized into tighter, better protected groups. Escort carriers were assigned to shield supply runs. Engineers developed faster unloading techniques, pushing crates into the water for Marines to retrieve, or using improvised ramps to move cargo under fire. Storage pits were dug deep into the jungle for fuel, concealed from Japanese spotters and protected against bombardment. Fast transports, APDs converted from destroyers, began arriving with smaller loads but at higher speeds, slipping through Japanese patrols. Aviation mechanics built new workflows for keeping aircraft in the fight despite shortages. Construction units carved new supply roads, built revetments, and expanded the airfield under constant threat. Each development represented a shift in American thinking, that logistics was not merely a support function, but the foundation of strategy itself. As these efforts accelerated, the shape of the campaign began to change. What had once appeared to be a desperate foothold slowly transformed into a position capable of resisting collapse. The Marines still faced shortages and relentless attacks, but the rhythm of supplies, however fragile, grew steadier. And with each successful delivery, the Japanese assumption that the Americans would collapse under logistical strain became less certain. These angles, human endurance, tactical necessity, mistaken confidence, and logistical innovation, now converge toward a single question that would define the next phase of the campaign. Which nation could sustain the fight long enough to claim the island?
As the struggle deepened, the forces shaping Guadalcanal expanded beyond the battlefield. Supply chains stretched across thousands of miles, driven by factories, fuel depots, and shipyards that never saw the island but determined its fate. America's industrial capacity, still accelerating toward its wartime peak in 1942, began exerting pressure in ways the Japanese command could not counter. Every crate that reached Henderson Field reflected not just the bravery of the Marines or the skill of the Navy crews, but the output of a nation reorganizing itself for global warfare. Across the United States, assembly lines shifted to 24-hour schedules, producing engines, ammunition, radios, bulldozers, and the countless small parts necessary to support modern operations. Even as individual Marines went hungry, the larger machinery of American logistics was gaining momentum. This industrial weight reshaped the psychology of the campaign. The Marines on the island could not see the factories of California or the steel mills of Pittsburgh, but they felt their influence each time a convoy broke through Japanese pressure. Confidence grew slowly, from whispers in the mess lines to the quiet certainty shared by officers in nightly briefings. If supplies continued to arrive, even inconsistently, their chances of holding the island increased. The Japanese, meanwhile, experienced the opposite. Each failed attempt to neutralize Henderson Field, each convoy forced to scatter under American air attacks, deepened the frustration of commanders who had once been certain of victory. Reports from the front described soldiers arriving weak, fatigued, and short of equipment. The belief that American resolve would collapse before Japanese endurance began to look less like a principle and more like an assumption built on fading memories of earlier campaigns. Terrain amplified these psychological shifts. Guadalcanal's geography created problems for both sides, but Japan suffered more severely. Its supply routes stretched across open water, constantly patrolled by American aircraft. Destroyers running the Tokyo Express had to navigate narrow channels in total darkness, unloading men and provisions at speeds too fast to deliver meaningful quantities of cargo. What little reached the shore was often lost in the dense jungle, scattered along trails that dissolved under heavy rain. Japanese units inland operated with almost no vehicles. Every artillery shell, mortar round, and sack of rice had to be carried by hand through miles of undergrowth. Hunger became a persistent enemy. Soldiers were reduced to eating coconuts, insects, and whatever they could forage. Some units marched into battle already weakened by starvation. For the Americans, geography remained punishing but manageable. Their supply lines were longer yet better protected. Once materials reached the island, engineers carved storage areas, reinforced roads, and established predictable routes to the front. Henderson Field provided a defensive umbrella across the surrounding sea, allowing U.S. ships to approach more frequently and with growing confidence. The presence of the airfield turned the landscape from an obstacle into an advantage. These interconnected factors created a new dynamic. Japan fought against time, while the United States fought to buy more of it. The longer the campaign lasted, the more apparent the imbalance became. American strength did not lie solely in superior resources, but in the ability to transform those resources into functioning systems, even under fire, in mud, and in a climate that eroded metal and morale alike. Japan relied on speed and boldness, but Guadalcanal demanded endurance, and endurance required steady supply. By late October, observers on both sides recognized a shift. The Japanese were still capable of launching fierce assaults, still able to deliver troops on fast destroyers, and still willing to expend tremendous effort to break the American perimeter. But each offensive came with fewer supplies, fewer reinforcements, and diminishing hope. The Americans, though battered, increasingly found themselves rebuilding faster than the Japanese could break them down. The psychological tide turned, not in a single moment, but through the gradual realization that the United States was adapting, strengthening, and gaining control over the one factor Japan had assumed would remain firmly in their own favor. All these angles, industrial power, shifting morale, and the unforgiving landscape, soon converged into a moment of irreversible consequence. The campaign moved toward its defining phase, when logistics would no longer operate in the background, but stand openly as the force deciding the island's fate.
By late October 1942, the campaign reached a point where every decision carried outsized weight. The Japanese High Command still believed victory was possible, but the margin for success had narrowed to a sliver. Their offensives had been fierce, their night bombardments relentless, and their infantry operations determined. Yet each push toward Henderson Field revealed the same underlying problem. They were attacking with troops who arrived hungry, exhausted, and undersupplied. Their weapons were limited, their artillery starved of shells, and their medical units reduced to improvisation. The Tokyo Express could deliver brave soldiers, but not the lifeblood of a sustained campaign. Meanwhile, the United States was completing a transformation that had begun in the chaotic first weeks of the operation. Supply convoys, once timid, fragmented, and often forced to flee, became organized lifelines protected by coordinated air and naval coverage. Fast transports made daring runs into the waters around Guadalcanal, delivering crates that were offloaded even under threat of shelling. Engineering units worked night and day to repair and expand Henderson Field, making it capable of supporting more aircraft, more operations, and more rapid turnaround. The Marines holding the perimeter sensed a shift, subtle at first, but undeniable. They no longer fought with the desperation of men counting meals. They fought with the knowledge that reinforcement was possible. The Japanese recognized the danger. In late October, they launched their most ambitious attempt to seize the island. Reinforcements flowed down the Solomon's chain, including artillery units and elite infantry formations. The plan was clear: overwhelm the American defenses in a decisive night assault, bombard Henderson Field into silence, and restore the initiative. For a moment, it appeared the campaign's momentum might swing back toward Tokyo. Their determination remained unbroken, and their troops advanced with the belief that this final effort could push the Americans back into the sea. But the battlefield had changed. The Americans now had something they had lacked in August and September: sustainment. Henderson Field, though battered, was operational. Aircraft were fueled, armed, and waiting. Ammunition reserves, once dangerously low, had been replenished. Reinforcements had arrived in numbers sufficient to bolster weak points along the perimeter. And because supplies now flowed with greater frequency and reliability, units that had once been forced to ration every bullet could meet Japanese attacks with concentrated firepower. The turning point came not in a dramatic charge or a single explosive moment, but in the steady, grinding weight of logistics asserting itself over tactics. As Japanese infantry approached American positions, they did so with limited artillery support. Their units carried far fewer mortar rounds than the situation required. Their heavy guns, unable to receive consistent resupply, fired sporadically. Their soldiers, many already weakened by hunger, advanced with courage but little sustainment behind them. American defenses, by contrast, rested on stacks of ammunition kept dry and ready in freshly dug storage pits. Machine gun teams had belts laid out in careful rows. Mortar crews worked with the confidence that more rounds could be delivered when needed. Even basic necessities like water and medical supplies were available in quantities that allowed units to stabilize quickly and return to the fight. As the night battle unfolded, Japanese forces encountered a depth of resistance they had not expected. Each attack was met with concentrated fire, coordinated artillery support, and timely counterattacks enabled by units that no longer feared running out of essential supplies. Henderson Field's aircraft joined the battle at dawn, striking Japanese positions and disrupting their attempt to regroup. For the first time in the campaign, Japanese commanders saw the full impact of an American logistics system that had finally aligned with battlefield needs. The next phase of the turning point arrived at sea. U.S. naval forces, supported by increasingly effective air cover, began to challenge the Tokyo Express more aggressively. Japanese destroyers were forced into costly engagements, and several were lost. Each ship sunk represented an entire night's supply that would never reach the island. The Japanese army units waiting inland felt the consequences immediately. Their rations dwindled, their ammunition stocks thinned, and their capacity for renewed assaults faded. By November, the evidence was overwhelming. The Japanese could still deliver troops, but they could not deliver the tonnage necessary to sustain them. The Americans, on the other hand, were steadily increasing their volume. Shipments grew larger, more frequent, and more efficient. The long-feared collapse of U.S. logistics had not materialized. Instead, a system few believed could function at such a distance was beginning to operate with growing confidence. This shift would soon reach a symbolic and strategic milestone: the arrival of 5,000 tons of supplies per day, a volume that would have been unimaginable only weeks earlier. It marked the moment where logistics ceased to be the island's greatest vulnerability and became its greatest strength. The Japanese now faced a reality that contradicted every assumption they had carried into the campaign. The Americans were not starving, they were not weakening, they were becoming stronger. And the full impact of that transformation was about to reshape the rest of the campaign.
The closing weeks of 1942 revealed the true scale of the transformation underway on Guadalcanal.
What had begun as a precarious foothold held together by grit was becoming a fully supplied strongpoint, capable of withstanding and repelling every Japanese effort to dislodge it. As American logistics surged, the air above the island filled with new aircraft delivered in crates, assembled on the field, and flown into combat within hours. Pilots who once counted every gallon of fuel could now launch repeated sorties. Ground crews who once scavenged for spare parts now worked with organized inventories. Henderson Field, once a battered dirt strip under constant threat, had evolved into a functioning hub that could absorb damage and remain operational. The Japanese soldiers facing this growing force were experiencing a starkly different reality. Their supplies had been cut to a trickle, and the Tokyo Express, always limited in capacity, was now operating under increasingly dangerous conditions. U.S. aircraft were patrolling farther, earlier, and in greater numbers. American naval activity near the island intensified. Every destroyer risked interception, and even when Japanese ships reached the island, their hurried offloading delivered only fragments of what frontline units required. Soldiers in the jungle waited in vain for crates of rice that never arrived. Some units marched miles to retrieve shipments that consisted of little more than ammunition for rifles, with no food to accompany them. Hunger sharpened into starvation. Disease, long present on the island, now spread rapidly among men weakened by malnutrition. These disparities shaped the decisive engagements of November. When Japanese commanders ordered renewed offensives, their troops advanced with the same courage and determination seen throughout the campaign, but with diminishing capacity for prolonged fighting. Their artillery batteries, lacking the shells required for sustained bombardment, fired sporadically. Mortar teams carried limited ammunition. Machine gun crews rationed their belts in the same desperate way the Marines had months earlier. Meanwhile, American defenders had become accustomed to receiving supplies in quantities that supported protracted engagements. Their gun pits were stocked, their forward positions were reinforced, their medical corps had enough equipment to sustain wounded men through several days of combat. One of the most defining moments came during the naval battles off Guadalcanal in mid-November. Japanese forces attempted a major push to neutralize Henderson Field once and for all, sending battleships to bombard the airstrip and escorting fresh troops for another assault inland. The Americans met them with a combination of surface ships, carrier aircraft, and Henderson Field squadrons operating in tight coordination. Heavy losses occurred on both sides, yet the outcome was unmistakable. The Japanese could no longer dominate the waters around the island. Their warships suffered defeats that made resupply even more perilous. Their transports, already overloaded with men but lacking food and equipment, were bombed, sunk, or forced to beach themselves. Thousands of Japanese soldiers reached land only to find that most of their supplies had been destroyed in transit. The Marines and Army units on Guadalcanal sensed this shift not through intelligence briefings, but through the growing silence of the Japanese guns and the diminishing intensity of their attacks. Patrols found abandoned positions containing little more than empty canteens, rotting uniforms, and improvised shelters. Prisoners revealed that entire battalions were surviving on handfuls of rice per day. The once confident Japanese units, capable of coordinated assaults in earlier months, now struggled to muster the strength for even limited offensives. Hunger, exhaustion, and disease did what American firepower alone could not achieve. At the same time, American supply levels reached a historic peak. In late November and early December, cargo ships began delivering extraordinary volumes of material, fuel, ammunition, food, heavy machinery, and spare parts. The long-feared collapse of American logistics had instead reversed into an unprecedented surge. Convoys arrived with clockwork precision. Bulldozers unloaded from ships expanded the airfield. Trucks carried crates deeper inland to fortify new defensive lines. The arrival of 5,000 tons of supplies per day was not merely an achievement of scale, it symbolized a shift in the nature of the campaign. Guadalcanal was no longer an outpost at the edge of American capability. It was now an island supplied with such abundance that further Japanese offensives became logistically impossible.
For Japanese commanders, this shift forced a sobering reassessment. Reports from frontline units described men too weak to fight, artillery without shells, and positions collapsing not from combat but from starvation. Reinforcement attempts only deepened the crisis. Troops arrived with minimal equipment, adding to the burden of an already unsustainable supply chain. Japanese officers on the island warned their superiors that maintaining the fight had become untenable. The American situation, by contrast, improved with each passing week. Troops received full rations, restoring their strength. Aircraft losses were replaced in days, not weeks. Engineers expanded facilities, dug new fortifications, and prepared the island for future operations. What had once felt precarious now felt inevitable. The Americans were gaining dominance, not through a single decisive blow, but through the cumulative weight of logistics that Japan could not match. By the end of December, the contrast had become definitive. Japan still possessed discipline, courage, and capable leadership, but none of these could offset the logistical collapse now shaping every engagement. The Americans, supplied at levels unimaginable at the campaign's start, were preparing for a new offensive. The climax of the struggle had passed. What remained was the unfolding of consequences that would extend far beyond Guadalcanal.
By January 1943, the struggle for Guadalcanal had entered its final phase, defined now not by fierce clashes along the Guadalcanal River or the thundering of naval guns in Iron Bottom Sound, but by the stark and unavoidable arithmetic of survival. The Japanese High Command, once confident that American supply lines would collapse, now confronted an outcome they had never prepared for. The Americans were entrenched, steadily reinforced, and operating from an island base that grew stronger each week. The Marines who had once fought on half rations now received steady meals. Medical supplies arrived in quantities large enough to treat malaria cases and field casualties effectively. Artillery batteries that had once rationed shells were now capable of sustained bombardment. Even frontline infantry sensed the change, noting the growing stockpiles of ammunition, fuel, and equipment accumulating behind the lines. For the Japanese forces on the island, the situation had reached a breaking point. Entire companies were reduced to skeletal strength. Soldiers collapsed from hunger before reaching their jumping-off positions. Nighttime patrols found bodies along jungle paths, men who had simply stopped moving because their bodies could no longer continue. Malaria and dysentery ravaged the ranks. But unlike the Americans, the Japanese had almost no medicine to counter the spread of disease. Units that were once elite formations, hardened by years of conflict in China, were now shadows of themselves, operating on handfuls of rice per day. Even the most determined infantry could not mount effective attacks under such conditions. Japanese commanders, reading through grim field reports, realized that no level of bravery could offset the absence of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Attempts to reinforce the island had become increasingly suicidal. Destroyers running the Tokyo Express suffered heavy attrition. Fuel shortages within the Imperial Navy limited operational options, and the arrival of American air superiority made each run a gamble with diminishing returns. Troops arriving on Guadalcanal often stepped onto shore with little more than rifles slung across their shoulders. No heavy weapons, no adequate rations, and no hope of meaningful resupply. By contrast, American logistics turned Guadalcanal from a defensive responsibility into a platform for future operations. As supplies arrived in bulk, engineers expanded defensive positions, carved new roads through the jungle, and constructed additional storage facilities. The airfield complex grew, enabling more frequent and far-reaching sorties. Navy task forces rotated through the surrounding waters with increasing confidence, patrolling aggressively and further constricting Japanese movements. The Americans had moved from desperation to dominance, and every ton of material unloaded on the beaches reinforced the growing certainty that the island was theirs. The tipping point was reached when American reconnaissance confirmed the deteriorating condition of Japanese troops. What had once been a formidable fighting force had become a group struggling simply to survive.
The prospect of an American offensive suddenly seemed less like a future operation and more like an inevitability that the Japanese could not match in their weakened state. Tokyo's high command, after weeks of internal debate, recognized the strategic futility of continuing the campaign. The cost of attempting to retake Henderson Field had exceeded any possible gain. Japan's broader war effort was already strained, and Guadalcanal had become a drain on resources they could not afford to lose. In late January, Japanese leaders made a decision they had resisted for months. They would evacuate their remaining troops from the island. The operation, carried out with precision and secrecy, aimed to withdraw thousands of men under the cover of darkness, using destroyers that slipped in and out of American patrol zones with careful timing. These evacuees, exhausted, malnourished, and often ill, embodied the stark consequences of the logistical collapse that had defined the second half of the campaign. The Americans, unaware of the evacuation at first, continued strengthening their positions, preparing for the next phase of operations in the Solomons. Guadalcanal was no longer a fragile outpost. It had become a fortified base, supplied in quantities that demonstrated the full industrial reach of the United States. The island had changed hands not only through combat, but through the slow, relentless pressure of sustainment, a reality that would shape every major campaign in the Pacific that followed.
When the last Japanese destroyers slipped away from Guadalcanal in early February 1943, the campaign's end became undeniable. The evacuation, conducted with impressive coordination despite the desperate circumstances, preserved a portion of Japan's surviving troops, but it also signaled a strategic retreat with far-reaching consequences. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Imperial Japanese Army had relinquished captured territory because it could no longer sustain the fight. This was more than a tactical withdrawal. It was an admission that the foundational assumptions guiding Japan's early war strategy had collapsed under the weight of industrial and logistical reality. Reports filed by Japanese commanders after the evacuation captured this moment with stark clarity. They noted that their forces on the island had been reduced by starvation, that units lacked the most basic supplies, and that their ability to mount any coordinated offensive had disappeared long before the final battles. Even elite formations, units that once represented the best infantry Japan could field, were so weakened by hunger that many required hospitalization immediately upon evacuation. These accounts revealed a truth often obscured by the dramatic clashes for Henderson Field. The Japanese defeat had not been caused solely by American firepower, but by the inability to provide a fighting force with the essentials of war. American intelligence units analyzing captured documents came to a similar conclusion. They recognized that Guadalcanal had exposed a structural weakness in Japan's war strategy. It was fighting a modern industrial conflict with a logistical system designed for short campaigns. Japan's early victories had been achieved through rapid offensives and the exploitation of unprepared enemies, not through the sustained delivery of the massive quantities of material required for prolonged island campaigns. Guadalcanal demanded endurance, and endurance demanded supply, something Japan could not deliver. For the United States, the island became a defining symbol of what industrial power could accomplish when paired with adaptability. The shift from desperate shortages to the delivery of 5,000 tons of supplies per day demonstrated how quickly American logistics could evolve under pressure. The lessons learned shaped every major operation that followed. Convoy systems grew more sophisticated. Naval construction accelerated. Airfield engineers refined methods that would later be used across the Pacific, from Tarawa to Saipan and beyond. New classes of cargo ships, escort carriers, and landing vessels were developed with the explicit goal of preventing the kind of crises experienced in the opening months on Guadalcanal.
The Japanese, facing the consequences of their defeat, were forced to rethink their strategy. They recognized that even successful tactical engagements could no longer compensate for logistical inferiority. Their navy, stretched thin and suffering losses that could not be replaced, struggled to provide escort for future operations. Their army, weakened by the ordeal and facing shortages across multiple fronts, entered a period of defensive warfare that contrasted sharply with the aggressive momentum of 1941 and early 1942. Guadalcanal had become the dividing line between two phases of the Pacific War, one dominated by Japanese initiative and the other defined by American ascendancy. The broader strategic effects soon became clear. With Guadalcanal secured, the Allies gained a critical foothold from which they could launch operations into the Central Solomons, bypass enemy positions, and threaten the Japanese stronghold of Rabaul. More importantly, they gained confidence in their ability to maintain large forces across vast distances. What had once seemed an impossible logistical challenge now stood as proof that the United States could project sustained military power anywhere in the Pacific. In the years that followed, analysts would study Guadalcanal not only for its battles, but for what it revealed about the future of warfare. It demonstrated that modern campaigns were won by nations capable of sustaining operations long after the initial clashes ended. It proved that industrial production, shipping networks, and strategic planning were not background elements. They were the backbone of victory. And it showed that even courageous and well-trained troops could be defeated when the system supporting them collapsed. The consequences of Guadalcanal rippled outward, altering the confidence of commanders, shaping the allocation of resources, and redefining expectations about the war's trajectory. Japan had entered the conflict believing that speed and audacity could compensate for limited industrial capacity. Guadalcanal proved otherwise. The United States had entered the conflict shaken and untested. Guadalcanal revealed its ability not just to fight, but to endure, and to supply that endurance across the largest ocean on Earth. What remained was a deeper reflection on what this campaign meant not only in military terms, but in the larger story of the Pacific War.
Guadalcanal endures as more than a battlefield. It stands as a quiet, undeniable lesson about the nature of modern war, one learned not in a single night assault or a dramatic naval clash, but in the steady movement of ships, crates, and fuel across thousands of miles of ocean. What unfolded there revealed a truth often overshadowed by cinematic moments of combat. Victory belonged to the side that could feed its men, fuel its aircraft, replace its losses, and continue fighting long after its opponent had exhausted every reserve. For Japan, the campaign exposed the limits of wartime assumptions rooted in earlier conflicts. Courage, discipline, and tactical ingenuity could not compensate for empty storehouses and disrupted supply lines. Their belief that American logistics would collapse under pressure became a strategic miscalculation that shaped the remainder of the war. When Japanese commanders laughed at the idea that the United States could sustain a distant island campaign, they were relying on a worldview that no longer matched the realities of industrial conflict. Their troops fought with determination, but determination alone could not carry them across the final miles of jungle when ammunition ran out and starvation took hold. For the United States, Guadalcanal became a testament to adaptability and resolve. The shift from chaotic early supply attempts to the delivery of 5,000 tons of material each day represented more than a logistical achievement. It signaled the emergence of a war machine capable of sustaining enormous operations
operations across the Pacific. The Marines who endured the early hardships understood the significance of every incoming crate, but even they could not have foreseen how the island would reshape American strategy. Guadalcanal taught commanders that logistics was not a supporting arm, it was the essence of modern warfare. In the end, the campaign marked the moment when the Pacific War's momentum shifted permanently. Japan's withdrawal signaled the fading of its early war dominance. America's strengthening foothold signaled the rise of a force that could no longer be pushed back. Guadalcanal was a victory built not only on valor, but on supply, and it remains a reminder that in the vast expanse of the Pacific, the nation that could endure would ultimately prevail.